because of the recognition that you have, gods of your town, gods of your family, gods of your country, gods of nature, gods of the earth, gods of all kinds of things, it tends to add on rather than subtract. So over time, Egypt is an empire. Egypt takes over their neighbors. They take over Nubia in the Middle Kingdom. And what happens to the Nubian gods? They become part of the Egyptian pantheon. Okay, now they're our gods too, because these are our people, therefore these are our gods.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Jude 3 Project and welcome to the Bisrat podcast. I am your host for this podcast, Vince Bantu, and it is a pleasure and a blessing to welcome you all to this podcast, which is a ministry of the Jude 3 Project, which is purposed at equipping the body of Christ and the Black church and community to help us know what we believe and why. And the Bisrat Project is one of our special ministries in the Jude 3 Project, where we explore questions that are pertinent to early African Christianity. And part of that is we have dialogues and conversations with scholars that are specialists in various areas in early African Christianity. And today I am very excited and pleased to be joined by a friend and a colleague, Dr. Tamara Siuda. And so I want to welcome her to join me in this conversation today. Our topic for today is a very popular topic, very controversial, and also very live question in the Black community, not only in the United States, but actually in throughout the diaspora and even on the continent. And that is Christianity a copy of Egyptian religion? Is Christianity a copy of Egyptian or Kemetic religion? There are a lot of, it's a very live question. So we're going to get all into that today, but from a historical perspective. And I am so excited. And I think we could not have a better guest to speak to that question for multiple reasons. But I'm going to introduce now Dr. Siuda, and then we're going to get right into it. But Dr. Tamara Siuda has been researching and writing about Egypt and Egypt's pharaonic religion for 3 decades. She has a master's degree in Egyptology from the University of Chicago and a second master's degree in Coptic studies from Macquarie University. Tamara completed a PhD in religion from Claremont Graduate University, where she wrote her dissertation about Coptic martyrology and how it represents an evolution of the pharaonic ancestor cult. You see what I'm saying? She founded the House of Netjer, a modern temple of ancient Egyptian polytheism in 1989, and she serves as its spiritual leader. And so without further ado, I want y'all to give Dr. Siuda a virtual or a physical applause and welcome her to this podcast conversation. And again, Dr. Siuda, I just want to say hello and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to have a chance to talk about these things.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, just for the listeners, Dr. Siuda, you know this, but, again, like we've connected by doing Coptic studies, like kind of Egyptian Christian context. But, my expertise is not really pharaonic Egypt or kind of the traditional Egyptian religion. And so I've, engaged this because it's a live apologetical issue in my community. But I've gone to Dr. Siuda, y'all, to ask questions and really to get resources on more how that compares with the traditional religion of Kemet or of Egypt. And so I'm just so excited to be in this conversation with you, as you said. And to get right to the title of this episode, I was wondering, let's both just kind of reflect together on this question: is Christianity a copy of Egyptian or Kemetic religion?
The easiest answer is no.
If you want to. Yeah.
Like, no, it's not. Okay, the podcast is over. We can now go home. But, the big answer is no. The more complex answer is no, but there are many roots to Christianity, which I'm assuming that you talk about in your podcast all the time. And Christianity is a multicultural religion, and it comes from lots of places, and it picks up lots of things along the way, and it keeps them. So there are certainly significant Egyptian contributions to Christianity, by actual Egyptian Christians, by Ethiopian Christians, by Nubian Christians. who are themselves either converts from that earlier pharaonic religion, or they're living in a world where that is also being practiced at the same time. So they're familiar with it. To suggest that there's no connection between the two is disingenuous. And we can't say that they're completely separate, but it's also not correct that Christianity is only coming from that place, or that it owes everything that it has to that place.
Yeah, I definitely, I couldn't agree with you. I agree with everything you said. I think that, Christianity, I mean, I'm speaking as a Christian, not only as a scholar, but also as a pastor and as a, or as I like to use the Ethiopian word, a Nazrawi. As a Nazrawi, I definitely would agree with you that, that the Bisrat or Christianity has lots of different influences, Egypt being one of them. But I also would agree with, and I'd love your thoughts on this as we just kind of even really just kind of play around in this question a little bit. Like, for me, the idea of a religion being a copy of another religion, it just doesn't seem to me the way that the ancient world really saw things. And it really seems like kind of a modern, you know what I mean? Like kind of a modern imposition. I guess maybe two things is like, number one, just that way of seeing things is not how ancient people approached religion. But then also the implication that's made in the Black community when it's attempted to be proven, and we'll get into this in this episode, there's all these alleged, similarities between Christianity and pharaonic religion. And sometimes half or 75% of them aren't even accurate. But let's just say they were. Like, let's just say all of them were. I guess, there's this false claim that it's a copy, which to me feels like a modern way of approaching religion, and not the way that people did. But then the second part is there's an implication that if it were somehow like copying or borrowing, that somehow kind of like illegitimates it, or that somehow is and that to me also seems like a very modern way of looking at ancient religion. It seems to me that the ancient world, that not only are there similarities we could point to, as you said, it'd be disingenuous not to. There are similarities we could point to between Egyptian religion and Christianity, but there's also similarities we could point to between Egyptian and Sumerian religion, or Egyptian and Greek religion, and Christianity and Islam. And like you could point to similarities in almost every religion, but to do that doesn't mean that they're copying each other, and also that doesn't somehow like kind of remove legitimacy from that religion's teaching. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. And I'm going to get controversial right from the start. And I'm going to say that tendency to try to, say that something is new and improved, and then also at the same time to say that the old thing is also somehow venerable, and therefore being able to connect yourself to it, or say, oh, well, that's just a cheap copy of this. That owes more to capitalism and to colonialism than it does at all to religion or the way the humans work. It's something that's come about. It's something that's come about in our societies, and actually, it really troubles me when it happens with the Black community, because it says that the Black community is internalizing that colonialist stuff that says that earlier things can't be good, that they always have to be improved on, or conversely, that later things can't be good because they're just cheap copies of better previous things. There's a tendency to kind of accelerate that and make judgments about things based on their age. And we do that about people too. We assume certain things about young people and old people. So it's kind of an extension of that. But you're right. It's not something. We don't see ancient people. We don't see early Christians. We don't see early people who are practicing the pharaonic religion doing that. They're not having that kind of comparison with each other. For them, it's like if they see another group that has something in common, they think that's really neat. And they're just like, oh, well, that just kind of proves that we have something in common. It's like they're celebrating their commonality as opposed to focusing on how they're different or how they're better than each other in a lot of ways. I mean, not to say that they don't do that. Certainly there are, the ancients were not at all, incapable of being proud of themselves and putting other people down. But the desire to compartmentalize things like religion and pass values on them on the whole, and to decide this entire religion is inadequate because it's a copy of a previous thing. I don't think they would have done that, and I don't think we have any evidence that they're doing that.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder, like, what are, I mean, I think of like, I wonder what are some examples of like how, again, I think this word copy, I mean, I think you make some great points about capitalism. I use the word kind of, I isolated it to modernity or kind of a modern concept, but I think you have a great point about it.
Mm-hmm.
There being an extension of capitalism. And again, it just doesn't seem like that's a way that Christians or, other folks, thought about, about similarities. I don't even want to use the word copy because that has a negative, connotation to it, but there's similarities and influences.
Sure.
And I mean, I think that, I think about the Apostle Paul, who quotes Greek philosophers in the New Testament
Right.
and then draws parallels to things that they were saying and the claims of Christianity. Is he copying
No.
or is he copying these people? No, he's saying, look, there's a touch point here. There's a connection. And from his perspective and from mine, Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of all of these things.
Sure.
But, whether or not someone believes that or not, again, it's like, it's not this idea of copy. And so I wonder what would be some examples, for our listeners who maybe like myself, who aren't like specialists in, like, as you are in Pharaonic Egypt, like what would be some examples of some like ways in which Egyptian religion, the indigenous practices were themselves influenced by other religions. I think of things, I don't know, like I think of things like, the presence of other peoples, like the Hyksos or the Ptolemies or
Right.
even before that, like, but I just, I wonder what's, and the reason I ask this is because, we're kind of talking about this whole idea of copying, but also, a lot of times, in our community, when you have people who are, Kemetic or Hotep or, part of these different religions that are making this claim that Christianity is a copy of Egyptian religion, and then therefore it's invalid. They seem to be arguing from this. The other side of that coin seems to be that they seem to think that Egyptian religion was somehow this pure, unadulterated, uninfluenced kind of, it's the first religion, like it's before everything else. So not just Christianity, but they also say everything's copying off of Egypt. The Babylonians, the Persians, the Greek, the Muslim, everybody's copying off of Egypt. And so I guess, I think that maybe if we could elevate some examples of how, yes, Egypt influenced its neighbors, but also it itself was influenced, and maybe some examples of what that looked like, it could help to maybe, maybe nuance that perspective a little bit.
Sure. Well, first of all, one of the things that we don't think about when we think about either of these traditions is how old they are. And okay, we know exactly how old Christianity is, if only because we date our dates from Jesus. So Christianity is roughly 2,000 years old, right? So Egyptian religion, that pharaonic religion, that polytheism that exists in Egypt previous to Christianity, is at least twice as old, if not 3 times as old. So that's already mind-boggling. It's like Cleopatra, who is somebody that everybody talks about, is closer to Jesus, literally within 100 years, than she is to the beginning of the culture that she was queen for, by quite a bit, by almost triple. It's the age of this pharaonic tradition is hard. It's hard to wrap your head around.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you sit and you think about that, and you think about, okay, we know Christianity is about 2,000 years old. How is current Christianity different from the original Christianity that was started? Where it started, where it's at now. How is that different? How has that developed? How has that changed? I don't think anyone would suggest that it hasn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But okay, so that's 2,000 years. If you take this other tradition and you double that, you make it 4,000 years, or you make it 5,500 years, or you make it 6,000 years, or you take it back to when we first start seeing the symbolism, which is 12,000 years in the Neolithic. So that's 6 times longer. The idea that that is an unchanging tradition that has been the exact same for those whole 12,000 years is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we can't really even talk about it as a single tradition. It kind of, I also don't, I am of the opinion that you also can't talk about one Christianity. There are Christianities. Mm-hmm. There are cultural traditions. There are traditions that come up at certain times and then they go away at other times, or they develop into something else. There are multiple Christianities. They all come from the same, they're all basically branches of the same tree. But there are multiple Christianities. And then I would also say that there are multiple Kemetic traditions. There are Egyptian religions, plural. And they change over time. At the same time, something that they all keep in common, and this is probably part of why people get that idea that it stays the same, is that it, as a moral value, as a practitioner value, it says that the closer that you can keep it to the way that your ancestors gave it to you, the better. And there is a very conservative tradition, especially in the temples, to use rituals that came from earlier times. They copied them. When the papyrus breaks down, then they copy it onto something else, and they keep using the same things. They don't value innovation. It's more of a value of this was given to us in a certain way, and it's our responsibility to perpetuate it. But then, at the same time, this is a polytheism. This is a tradition that believes in lots of gods, none of which cancel the others out, none of which are expected to be worshipped above all the others. That's not something. I mean, there are regional gods. If you live in a certain city, there are certain gods that are going to be more important to you than others, but that doesn't mean that other gods don't exist. And because of that, because of the recognition that you have, gods of your town, gods of your family, gods of your country, gods of nature, gods of the earth, gods of all kinds of things, it tends to add on rather than subtract. So over time, Egypt is an empire. Egypt takes over their neighbors. They take over Nubia in the Middle Kingdom. And what happens to the Nubian gods? They become part of the Egyptian pantheon. Okay, now they're our gods too, because these are our people, therefore these are our gods. They take over parts of the Levant, they take over Canaan, they take over parts of Syria, they take over parts of what's now Israel. Those gods get incorporated. They generally stay where they came from. I mean, only a couple of the Nubian gods actually get worshipped outside Nubia, but they become part of the general tradition, and so everybody's familiar with them. So there's this continual addition. If you believe in lots of gods, there are always more. So as the religion goes on, it does get bigger, and it does pick up more traditions, and it picks up more people, because Egypt does. When it's earlier and when it's more xenophobic, when they're just sort of in the Nile Valley and they're not messing with their neighbors at all, it doesn't happen as much. But especially after the New Kingdom, like you mentioned, the Hyksos. After the Hyksos, with the introduction of the chariot and the introduction of imperial warfare and colonization, and the Egyptians were doing this. They were taking over other countries. So they were bringing home those people, both as prisoners of war and sometimes as, in particular with people in the Levant, the people we call the sea people. They hired them as navy, they hired them as mercenaries. These people are moving to Egypt, they're intermarrying, they're staying in Egypt, they're becoming part of Egyptian culture, and so their religion and their religious practices also come in to a certain degree, whether or not they're formally adopted, like on a cult level. Like I said, some of the Nubian deities did not get worshipped across Egypt. But they're all recognized as gods. They're all, there are multiple religious texts that talk about respecting gods where you are. Now, if you go travel somewhere and they have different gods, then you need to be nice to their gods. I personally believe that that's part of why Christianity catches on so fast in Egypt compared to other places. Because Egypt does not have any kind of idea that says that more gods isn't okay. So it's like, oh, here's another god. This god's kind of cool. We like him. And particularly in Egypt at the time that Christianity comes in, it's being colonized by Rome, and that's not a very comfortable situation. Egyptians, culturally, and part of the Pharaonic religion, they believe that heaven's going to be in a continuation of the current life. Well, if the current life isn't so great, and then your neighbor who's a Christian tells you, hey, we believe in an afterlife where there aren't any Romans and there isn't any tax and there's none of this terrible stuff, of course you're going to convert. It makes sense. There's no betrayal there. There's nothing in the Egyptian mindset that says that's not an okay thing to do. Or a relationship with your God. So Egyptians really pick up Christianity. They think it's very good, and then they pick it up, and then they also start sharing it with their neighbors.
That's so helpful. That's so helpful, Dr. Siuda, because and you probably know this too, but I think that it's really helpful to point out, certainly in the Ptolemaic and Roman period, there's all kinds of blending and influences, and even the Hyksos, but that's usually acknowledged by many people in the Black community that are some form of Kemetic practitioners. But usually that's often, kind of still dismissed because there's still a belief that, but before the foreign influences, so there's still kind of this mentality of there's this foreign pollution or this kind of foreign infiltration in Egypt that's diluting the purity. So I think it's just really helpful that you're pointing out that even before Nubia conquered Egypt, or before the Hyksos did, or before the Ptolemies did, there was already interchange, and there was already conversation and religious adoption, even through Egypt's own conquest, that they willfully, it wasn't like they were being for it, they willfully incorporated Canaanite or other deities into their, because there was no sense. I mean, if I'm understanding you right, there's no sense of, and this is maybe where I would say Christianity is very distinct actually from Egyptian religions, that there's no sense of like, I have to worship or pray to this God only and no other God. Whereas for Christians, Egyptian or otherwise, there's like, no, we only worship Jesus.
We only worship Jesus, right?
We refuse to worship anybody else, and so I think that's just really, I think that's really helpful. I think another question that we should probably dig into even more specifically, because I think we're helping in some broad conceptual ways. Again, just how people should really think about Egyptian religion and antiquity. Maybe maybe we could drill down into some more specifics about Horus and Jesus, right? Because that's where a lot of the conversation happens. Is basically, again, there's this, and I'll just rattle off some of them. Like, you can see this in YouTube videos and websites, and I mean, it's not. I don't think it's a shocker that none of this is usually published in like actual serious scholarship, but nonetheless, it's extremely prominent in our community. And so there's this whole thing that the Christian gospel story was just completely plagiarized from Egyptian religion. Jesus was born he's the son of God, just like Horus is. He was born of and I'm not saying these things are actually true similarities. I'm saying that these are the so-called similarities that are put out there, that, Mary was a virgin and Isis was a virgin. And Jesus was born in a manger and Horus was born in a manger, and that Jesus was baptized and Horus was baptized, and that Jesus was crucified and Horus was crucified on the cross, and that Jesus rose again and Horus rose again, and Jesus is the Son of God. And so there's an attempt to connect that with Horus being connected to the S-U-N, son, to say nothing of the fact that these are English words and do not correlate at all to just other words. So, but these are just some of but this is extremely popular, this mythology and this theory. And so I wonder if we could just kind of talk about that a little bit, and what do we make of this idea that specifically the story of Jesus is copied from the story of Horus.
So it's interesting to me that the god, so we have a situation where there's an Egyptian god who gets compared to Jesus earlier, like 100 years ago. And it's not Horus. It's Osiris, Horus's father. Because this is a god who dies, because he's considered to be a god of resurrection, because he's considered to be the judge of the dead and the king of the dead. So very, very early Egyptologists latch onto this, and they're like, oh, he's a dead god, he's a resurrection god, he's like Jesus. And for a long time, that's what you read in the literature, that Osiris is a Jesus-like god, or he is actually some sort of prototype of Jesus. You read both things, neither of which are supported in a lot of ways, other than the fact that I already mentioned that this religion is much, much, much older. But you read that, and then recently, and this is very recently, this is probably in the last 20 years, we've had this shift to identifying Jesus with Horus. I think it has to do mostly, like on YouTube and things like that, most recently, I went down the rabbit hole. I tried to figure out where it's coming from. And a lot of it's coming from a film. There was a movie called Zeitgeist that talked about a whole bunch of symbolism and how these various symbols are proof of other things. It has a very white, very new age kind of background to it. And they make a really good case about that. And it seems like some people latched onto that, and then because they had other agendas trying to compare the religions, that was a really good thing to look at and say, oh, well, Jesus isn't even original; he's just this copy of this other god. But the even trying to fit the two gods together is not as good of a fit. Cyrus is actually dead. He died, and in fact, he was murdered. He didn't just die. So there is a place where they have that in common, but Osiris does not necessarily die for salvation. the story is that that people are dying. Death has come into the world and people are dying, and the dead don't have any gods. Because all of the gods are living, the dead are all alone in the place where they are. And so Osiris takes pity on them and he wants to be with them. But it also turns out, according to the rules of the universe, that gods can't die. So nobody knows how to fix this. And then it turns out, and then, it goes a little bit further. Osiris's younger brother, Set, who is the embodiment of strength and also of challenge and like boundaries. He's a trickster god. He challenges the rules of the universe. And so he's a very, very strong god. And in fact, is strong enough to kill gods. So Osiris and Set make an agreement, and Set murders him in order that he can die, in order that he can be part of the world of the dead. So this idea of compassion for humans is certainly similar. And the idea that, he goes to the land of the dead to be with the dead is similar. But other than that, no, Osiris never embodies as a human. There is a myth that says that he does, but it's very late and it's not actually Egyptian. It's a Greek myth. He doesn't. So he's not a human. He's not born of a virgin. He doesn't do any of this. There's no salvation story there. So it's very different. And then Horus is totally different. He is a child who's born to his mother after his father is dead, and his entire story is one of vengeance. That he needs to, even though Osiris agreed to become dead, there has still been a violation of the morals of the universe because gods can't die. Set did something very wrong, and therefore there's punishment that has to happen. So it's two things. Horus needs to make sure that sin of murder has been punished, and also Set needs to challenge the child Horus to make sure that he is good enough to be king and to take his father's place. So his job is also to be the challenger and the loyal opposition. So they're both fulfilling their roles when we read the mythologies of the two of them fighting. Again, that's not at all like Jesus. Jesus doesn't fight anybody to be the king of anything. Jesus doesn't have an older brother who challenges him, or an older. He's not incarnate on the earth in order to do any sort of vengeance. It's quite the opposite. He's there to fix problems and to seal things and to give salvation to people. Horus is called a savior. Absolutely, that's true. Actually, one of his titles is Harandotis or Haranajitef, means savior of his father, but that's it. He's the savior of his father. He's not the savior. He's not the savior of sin. He is specifically doing something to redeem the evil that was done to his own. So. But like I said earlier in the conversation, you can say no, but there are also these weird little nuances that complicate it. Isis is not a virgin in the sense, in the sense that we think of it modernly. But then, of course, Virgin Mary might not have been either. The word that we translate virgin is not necessarily someone who's never had sex. It's someone who is in charge of their own life. A woman who does not have to answer to a man is a Parthenos. So. That's kind of aside. They both get called by that title. It has a slightly different meaning in antiquity. Isis is being called Mother of God thousands and thousands of years before Jesus is, or I'm sorry, before Mary is, before Jesus comes into being. Before the Christianity even happens, she has this place where she's being called Mother of God, and she has imagery. There's lots of iconography, beautiful statues, paintings of Isis with the baby Horus on her lap. Sometimes she's breastfeeding him, something he's just sitting on her lap. This imagery is very influential among earlier Christians. They this image and they think certain things. And so, when they come into their new religion and they understand the story of the Virgin Mary, that image comes back to them. They're not seeing Isis in it, I don't think. I think they're just seeing the idea that they're already familiar with. I also think that there's probably literal transmission of that Isis imagery into the Mary imagery because of something interesting that happened at the Temple of Philae, which is in the south of Egypt at Aswan. So on the Nubian border, there's a Temple of Isis, which also has a church in it. it. I take people to Egypt. We do tours, and it's always very interesting when you take them into the first part of this temple. When you go into the first room of this temple, literally half of the first room, the images of the pharaonic gods have been crossed out, kind of scratched out, or they're covered up with other writings or other things. And there's a Christian altar, and there's a niche in the wall where the host was kept, and it's clearly Christian, but only in half of the room, and it's exactly half. It's literally like the room got split in half. That one side of the room is Christian and one side of the room is not. One side of the room has Jesus and Mary images. One side of the room is all Isis and her family. And it's real curious. And, people come in and even tour guides will say, oh, well, this is just proof that the evil Christians came in and destroyed all of the pharaonic things. Or conversely, this is just proof that the Christians came in and cleaned up all of these evil pagan images. Depending on their own agenda, they characterize them in ways. But what really happened, and the fact that it's half and half, if you were either destroying something or improving something, you wouldn't do half of it and stop. But what happened, and we actually have proof of this, the priests of Isis who ran the temple, who were half Nubians and half Egyptians, by the time that Christianity comes to us, most of the practitioners of the Isis religion are still Nubians. The Egyptians pretty much all become Christian pretty quickly because there are a bunch of monasteries in the area, so it's something that happens pretty fast. But the Isis worshippers are still coming to this temple for holy days, and it's a very holy place for them, a very sacred place for them. So what happens is the priests of Isis and the local Christian priests make a compromise, and the priests of Isis let the Christian priests have half the room, and they worship alongside each other. It's kind of like now where one church doesn't have a building, and so another church lets them have a space. It's exactly the same thing, and they do this. They do this for 500 years.
Wow.
Not like they did it for a week or, until they built a new building. They literally were worshiping right alongside each other from the beginning of Christianity until Theodosius shuts that temple down. Theodosius shuts the temple mostly for political reasons because he's worried about the number of Nubians who all come up. Large Nubians, thousands and thousands of them are coming up for these big Isis festivals, and he's getting very nervous about his southern border. And so it's not, they couch it as a religious decision. Well, now we're not going to have any more temples to the pagans. That's a thing. But it's also a political decision because if the temple closes, the Nubians don't come anymore. They're not supposed to come anymore. It didn't quite work out that way. They kept coming. Interestingly enough, as the most recent year I was there, which was 2011, there are still Nubians coming up to worship Isis at that temple. It's still happening. Very, very quiet, but it is still happening. But in any case, so when people talk about the connections between these two traditions and the interface between them and how they might influence each other, that's a real obvious place where that's happening. You have an image of Isis on one wall, and 6 feet over here you have an image of Mary on the other wall, and they're almost the same. There are similar things going on there, but similarity doesn't mean sameness. Humans have things in common. There are lots and lots and lots of religions that talk about mother gods. That have child gods. That's not an uncommon thing. It doesn't mean they all come from the same root. I mean, yeah, they all come from the same root in the sense that we're all humans and we all think motherhood is important. Yeah. But it doesn't make them the same.
That's right. No, wow. That's just I have to just highlight some of the amazing things you just laid down, because I think that's just such, all of that is just such helpful information. I mean, number one, like the sources themselves show us. I mean, if we look at the Bible and early post-biblical Christian literature, and then if we look at pyramid texts and pharaonic texts and, material from Egypt, we see these communities speaking for themselves, showing us that they are not the same. That I remember actually in our discussion before this podcast, you even made a comparison I thought was funny, but true. Said that the story of Horus actually has more in common with the Lion King than it does with
it really
the story
does.
of Jesus in the Gospels. And the story you just laid out, proves that, it demonstrates that. And of course there were similarities. But I mean, and I just want to say something about that not only as a scholar of Egyptian Christianity, but also as a pastor and as a Christian, is that, I think that, there's a degree to which every religion incorporates and excludes to certain degrees, in different ways. For me as a Christian, For me, the boundary of exclusion is the Bisrat. The name of this podcast is the Bisrat, is the gospel message. It is receiving grace by faith in the person and work of Jesus Christ. That Jesus is he is God. He's fully human, but he is also God. He's not one of many gods, but that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one God and the creator of all things, and that there are no other gods except for him. And that by his crucifixion and resurrection and by faith in that, we are saved from sin. So exactly as you said, that's a completely different agenda than what Horace or than what Marduk or
right.
Carlos or anybody else has. And in fact, I would personally say that the agenda, so to speak, of Jesus is probably more unique, actually, maybe even more different than, and there would probably be more comparisons between maybe the agenda of Horus and maybe other gods and god families in like Babylonian or Sumerian or Greek mythology or stories, where oftentimes it more has to do with, as you said, kind of like leadership of a certain realm of existence or leadership of a nation, and even kind of the way that those gods fall into that. And certainly often preservation of the dead. But there's really no concept like the Christian concept of the curse of sin, and the inability of humans by any good deeds to overcome that, and the need for the only God to come in, and the idea of like being a ransom or being a kind of a being, as you said earlier, like dying on the cross to take on the sins of humanity. That's not only very distinct from Horus, it's not only very distinct from Egyptian gods and goddesses, it's also very distinct from most other ancient religions in the ancient world, who actually, I would say, are actually more similar to each other. And even the exclusivity that Christians like myself and others have about, that being the kind of the boundary, and so we don't go outside of that, is also different, because there might have been degrees of exclusivity with Egyptian or Nubian or Sumerian or Babylonian religion, but there was also a high degree of inclusivity. Like, yeah, we can pray to your God and pray to that God too. We can, pray to Isis and Serapis at the same temple, and it's all good. And that's something that Christians just do not do. And like, and that we don't do. And that's also kind of a distinction. But that example you gave of the Philae temple, I think is just such a powerful and visual depiction that really rebuts a lot of these common ideas. That I think of two things that it rebuts is, number one, that Christianity was a copy of Egyptian religion, because that shows us right there that these religions were certainly influencing each other and were certainly in communication and were neighbors, but they also, even by the fact that there was that half, that there's also very distinct, there's a line and saying you're doing this and we're doing that. And so, but also I think it also helps to, also clarify the reality that, and we see the same thing happening in Ethiopia. We see the same thing happening in Nubia. I mean, I know today we're talking about Egypt, and I want to get off on a tangent, but in the same way, I mean, you hear stories of Tekla Hymenot going into, the pagans, so to speak, or the practitioners of traditional religion in the Axum area, and again, calling them away from that. And there's a clear kind of Christian, quote unquote, pagan or traditional religious practitioner distinction. Same thing in Nubia. And so, I think one point that's also interesting to bring out that a lot of people in the Kemetic community will say is that when you have this destruction and this violence, like things from Theodosius or, the riot in Alexandria in the mid 400s, and you see this traditional religion and Christian violence, there's often this assumption that, well, that all came from the Roman Empire and it was just kind of imposed. But actually, a lot of times, some of that violence, that Christian violence visited upon practitioners of Christian religion, were done by African Christians, like Egyptian, Nubian, Ethiopian. It wasn't like they needed a Roman Empire to have them do that. They were doing it. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. In fact, I would say that's a bad thing. But it also dispels the myth that Christianity only came. And actually, I was wondering if we could go there next, for one of our, and I'm kind of already answering it, but I'd love your thoughts on it as well, because another big belief in the Black community and really a lot of communities around the world, and especially in the Kemetic community, is that Christianity is a white man's religion, right? That Christianity comes from the white man. And in this case, I mean, certainly we can look at, we can look at, kind of the white evangelical support of Trump in our time, or we can look at white evangelical support of slavery or segregation, land violation rights of indigenous peoples, and we can go into slavery and colonialism. We can go all the way back to the Crusades, but going back into antiquity, for most people, the imagination of this starts with Constantine, and but the idea is that Christianity started with Constantine, and that it started by the Roman Empire, and it was just a vehicle from the beginning. It was a vehicle of oppression, of Roman colonization, and that before Constantine, before he called the Council of Nicaea, there was no Christians that believed Jesus was God. There was no, and it all came from the Greco-Roman world, and then it was imposed upon, African people and other non-European peoples. This is the idea. But I think, again, a lot of this evidence we're seeing from Christians in Egypt, which was part of the Roman Empire, to be sure, but even from independent, nations like Nubia and Ethiopia, or India, or the Persian Empire, to me, clearly rebuts the idea that Christianity is a white man's religion, or in this context, that it's an extension of the Greco-Roman Empire. But that it was, something that started in Palestine, and started primarily with Hebrews, but then in Acts 2 very quickly went in every direction. It included Romans, but it also included a Nubian in Acts 8, and it also included Persians, so many, and then at least by the 3rd century, it included Indians in the subcontinent. And so, and this is all way before Nicaea, way before Constantine. But so anyway, I would just love any thoughts you have on that, about how we should, especially thinking about it in a Kemetic context, how we should think about this concept of, that Christianity is a white man's religion, and just your thoughts on that.
I really find that distressing, honestly. That the Black community would accept that uncritically, because it basically lets the white people win. It lets the white supremacy win. It rewrites the history of Christianity to be something that only picked up values in the last 300 years. It really bothers me. The reason, you talked about that people will define Christianity as starting with Constantine. Well, the reason that they do that is because they've decided that Constantine is white, because Constantine represents civilization in the Roman Empire and, the official government religion. Yes, absolutely. Constantine is the person who is pretty much responsible for Christianity becoming what it is now, which is a global religion. One wonders how far it would have gotten if the Roman Empire had gone in a different direction and had not decided to adopt Christianity as an official faith. Previous to that, there were periods of time where they were killing Christians, lots and lots and lots of them, and they had decided that Christianity was a danger to the state. When Christianity becomes the state, everything changes. That's absolutely true. But the modern understanding of whiteness and the definition of things as belonging to white people or not belonging to white people is only several hundred years old. That's coming out of the 1600s. It's coming out of the 17th century idea of scientific racism. The whole reason that happens is because people who are engaging in slavery of people coming from Africa, a number of whom are actually Christians, because Christianity was already in Africa and had been there since the beginning, they need to be able to morally justify what they're doing. And so they have to figure out a way to make these people not people. And so there's this very tortured sort of, well, only these people are actually human and everybody else isn't. And they're primitive and they don't know what they're doing and they need to be saved and they need to be given, and not only does it become, we need to impose our culture on them, we need to impose our religion on them. And so then, yes, there is absolutely a white supremacist Christianity that is behind this. And there is a white supremacist Christianity that exists, or maybe multiple ones, I don't even know. Mm-hmm. Not something I study, but it's something I notice. There are certainly Christianities that are white men's religions, but I don't think Christianity as a whole is, and I don't think it has to be. And I would argue that the historical Jesus, and the people who founded that religion would be horrified at the idea that Christianity belonged to any one group of people and that everybody else was, not good enough to have it, because that totally runs against the point. Christianity's whole entire approach in the beginning was that this is a religion of salvation for everyone, and everyone is welcome. That's why the Roman state was scared of it. Because it wasn't like the rest of their, they had a bunch of little savior cults going on. You could join a secret group and you could get the special dispensation of a various deity, like Dionysus. Isis actually becomes that in Rome. Her worship from Egypt changes into a salvific, like a club, basically. You join a club, you become a follower of Isis, you get Isis's protection. This is the thing. Christianity is different from this. Christianity says, no, we're not going to be exclusive. Everybody can be a Christian if they want to be. All they have to do is believe. And so it doesn't have any limits. It can get as big as it needs to get, which makes sense because it teaches that it is for everyone. I mean, there's nothing in what Christianity does that doesn't make sense according to its message, until you get to a point where you start declaring that Christianity is only for this group of people, or only for that group of people, or only this way. It's not.
Yeah. That's such a great point. It really, there's so many great points, and it connects with actually another, we had Dr. Catherine Gerbner on this podcast as well. And, she makes a great point going into the 17th and 18th centuries of, European, so-called, I call it so-called Christian because I don't call human stealers Christians myself, but so-called Christian slavery, and it was so fascinating to see that there was actually these examples, especially early on, where actually the Europeans in the Caribbean and North America were trying to stop Black people from becoming Christians, because they actually knew that if they read the Bible, they would understand that, oh, this thing says I can be free. And so
this thing says I'm supposed to be free. Exactly.
I'm supposed to be, yeah. And it's not until the 19th century, like antebellum, that you start to see this kind of argument, oh, Christianity is good for the slaves. It keeps them, civilized. And so we need to impose it upon them. But actually for, almost 3 centuries before that, it's actually an attempt to there's this fascinating evidence of Christians, of African slaves in the Americas who are Christians nonetheless, and are actually petitioning for their freedom and petitioning for their right to celebrate, the Christian sacraments. And another great point you made that connects, that I could not agree with more, is that the Bible itself refers to, it clearly teaches exactly what you're saying, that Christianity is not associated with any one religion. And if anything, I just had actually a friend of mine who's a New Testament scholar the other day say this, that is perhaps maybe one of the single greatest agendas of the entire New Testament. I mean, if you look at the New Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament, over and over, that is what the writers of the New Testament are just so obsessed with communicating, and just deeply concerned with, is communicating the idea that was popular in the earliest years of Christianity, that, oh, this is a Jewish thing, and this is for Hebrew people only. And Paul and Peter and James and all of the early apostles are drilling it into their church. No, it is not just for Hebrews, and you better get used to having these Gentiles worshiping right next to you. The people that, Acts 10, the people that we thought were unclean, actually they've been brought in to the household of God, exactly like you said. It's for all people. And the other thing that I think, if we could just maybe, cover maybe 2 more quick questions. The other thing that I think that you said is that exactly right, that Jesus, not would be, because Jesus is alive, I believe, and Jesus is horrified at the idea, and yes, the apostles and the early church.
I'm trying not to speak for him, which is why I said that.
Yeah. No, that's cool.
But I think you're right. I do.
Yeah, and the early church would, I completely agree, the early church would be horrified, because again, that's what they fought to make clear in Acts 10 and Acts 15. This is for everyone. It's not associated with one culture. And it's even in our theology to incorporate to a degree. There's a degree to which we can incorporate. I mean, John calls Jesus the Logos. That's not a Hebrew concept. That's a Hellenistic concept. So there's a degree of incorporation, because we believe that God's presence and image is upon every human being, and that the Holy Spirit has been speaking to all cultures. So there are things in Egyptian culture that are in agreement with biblical teaching. And I mean, a lot of the early Egyptian Christians use ankhs as crosses. There's an agreement there. And certainly there's degrees to which we have, that the early Egyptian Christians rejected a lot of what they did. You read of Pachomius, kind of speaking against, some of the Egyptian practices and all that. But that's the situation that we, according to our theology, find ourselves in now, that there should not be just one or another. There shouldn't be a rejection of our culture and our ancestry before we heard the gospel. But there also shouldn't be a wholesale rejection or demonization of it. But it's a both and process, because we believe our cultures themselves are redeemed through Jesus. And so, and I mean, and the problem though is that, and the other thing too, I mean, we were talking about white supremacy in Christianity, and white supremacists, I don't even want to call it Christianity, but white supremacist Christendom, maybe we could say, is that there's a hypocrisy to it as well, because there's a demonization of African spirituality, of indigenous spirituality. And again, there's some things about African spirituality that as a believer, I don't agree with, but there are a lot of things that are good. I think actually God's image is in it. And on the flip side, there's all sorts of European pagan imagery in dominant Christianity, and that just goes unquestioned, like Easter and Christmas trees, and there's all kinds of things that come from European so-called pagan or traditional religion, and we have no problem doing that. But I mean, if we instead of calling the Resurrection Sunday, we call it Easter, we call it by an Anglo-Saxon goddess, we could just as easily call it Horus, or we could call it Aludare, or we could call it a voodoo god, and like that would be the same thing as calling it Easter. But everybody be like, no, you can't do that. I'm like, well, then why can you call it Easter? And so yeah, but there's a flexibility to it to a degree, that has to be critically and done for us. It has to be done according to Scripture and the Bisrat and the Holy Spirit. But again, I just couldn't agree with you more that the early church would be horrified at the state of that things have gotten to. And so in line with that, I wonder, if what do you think? How would you feel that, like, specifically an early Egyptian Christian, or an early Egyptian practitioner of traditional religion, how would you, like, how do you think that they would answer the claims of modern Kemetic, people saying Christianity is, it's a copy of Egyptian religion, it's a copy of Horus, and therefore it's illegitimate? Like, how do you, I mean, of course we can't know, but just, how do you think, based on your scholarship and, what do you think they would say if they were in this conversation and seeing these YouTube videos? Like, how do you think they would respond to that?
I think we actually can know how at least a few of them felt about it, because some of them talked about it, and some of them talked about it at length. There is a lot of theological argument about Origen and how much paganism influenced him or didn't, and whether that was a good or bad thing. And clearly, if there's a controversy about that, then there must be a difference between the things. If you don't think of this pre-Christian tradition as different from what you're doing, you wouldn't have a problem with him having thoughts about it or writing about it. In Alexandria, the riots that you mentioned, pagan temples get destroyed by groups of monks, and then groups of monks get attacked in return by practitioners who are upset that happens. There's a back and forth that goes on for quite some time, with various acts of violence of the various groups of people against each other. If it's the same thing, that wouldn't happen. It doesn't need to happen. Shunuta of Atripa in the middle of Egypt. Now, this actually goes back to what I was saying earlier about the Temple of Philae. It's actually, I'm glad you brought this up, because I get to make the point that while, yes, at the Temple of Isis at Philae, they got along, and they got along very well for a number of centuries, that was not always the case in all parts of Egypt. And in some parts of Egypt, actually, Christians and polytheists did not get along at all. And in fact, they were actually warring with each other. Shunuta gives a whole lot of time in his letters to talk about how he is personally going to destroy the temples in the town where his monastery is, and goes out of his way. And I mean, it gets really graphic about how many things that he does to this man and to this man's temples. And he's very proud of this. If he considered that, what that man was doing was the same as what he was doing, that none of that would occur. There would be no bragging. There would be no attacks. That none of that happens. It's very clear to these people that there's something different. I would argue that most of the difference comes from the Christian side, because of the idea that Christianity, as you mentioned earlier, is exclusive, and that you only worship Jesus, that your focus is on Jesus and Jesus' message in the gospel. So there's not room in Christianity for the other traditions. Whereas in the polytheist tradition, if somebody wanted to have an altar to Horus in their house and also an altar to Jesus in their house, that's their business. No, you don't care, because they're gods, and you need to do what you need to do with your gods.
In fact, I think that's the case with Gesius.
Yes. Yeah, there are points where he goes to the temple and he tries to do stuff, and Shenouda totally blows that out of the water. He's like, no, you're still a pagan, you're awful. And so it's there, the distinction is there. And the distinction comes out of the Christian theology. I'm not passing a value judgment on that. I really think that is, something that's between people and their God. But it's there. It's always been. That's not new.
Yeah, and as a Christian, I'll pass a value judgment on it. I don't condone the violence that Shenouda was doing, and or any Christian.
That wasn't what I meant. I wasn't passing it. I'm not passing a judgment on how you decide which gods you worship or not. That's what I meant.
Oh, I see.
No, I also think that what Shenouda was doing was pretty awful.
Yeah.
But he was convinced that it was necessary.
Right.
What he writes in his letters is that he thought theologically that what this man was doing was demons and was Satan, and he was bringing other people into evil, and so it needed to be stopped, and that that was his justification.
Yeah. Well, that actually, just that. I think on the one hand, we can agree that the unfortunate violence that happened, oftentimes at the instigation of Christians, Egyptian Christians, that on the one hand, the fact that was there disproves this idea that it was a copy or seen as a copy. In fact, if anything, this tension and this distance that was there, oftentimes, more pronounced by Christians, even more kind of just that rampant exclusivity and claim to exclusivity, that could not be more different than traditional Egyptian religion. Like that's not, a thing. And so on the one hand, that tension, refutes the ideas and the claims of a lot of committed communities that, it was a copy and all that. No, they were very distinct and saw themselves that way. But on the other hand, it can be a cautionary tale for those of us that are Christians and all of us really, that the negative examples of sometimes the violence that happened. And so as we kind of bring it to a close, I guess a final, and I'd like you to just maybe close us out with some final words about, what do you think maybe would be for today, some tips or some suggestions or hopes that you would have for how, in the Black community, but also more broadly as well, in the white community as well, that Christians and practitioners of traditional Egyptian religion can dialogue and have conversations like this and even disagree theologically or historically or whatever, but also that we can do that in a good way. Just what would be some closing thoughts you would have on that?
Well, these things are hard to put into English, I think. Well, first of all, I don't think either tradition thinks that the creation and the deities sprang into being after the tradition. Christianity thinks that humans existed before Christianity, and therefore God must have created them. And certainly the Pharaonic religion also says that there was a time before time when the deities came together and decided to make a world because they were lonely and they wanted to have friends. So there's always this idea that there's something higher and older than us. Humans are not the height of things. We might be the first children of the Creator, and we might have special responsibilities as humans towards creation. But we are not the deities, and we shouldn't be trying to be. Following from that, I think we have to remember what we have in common as created beings, regardless of whether we think that, the Christian God created us, or we think that, Marduk created us, or we think that Apollo created us, or Gitchimanitu, anything like that. However you are comprehending that idea of creator, that's something we have in common. We have in common that we believe that we were created. It wasn't random. We have in common that we were put into the creation for a reason. We disagree on our instructions, but that from the polytheistic standpoint, that also makes sense. We have the idea that everybody gets their own instructions depending on who they are. But so we're all created beings. We all have a purpose. We all have a responsibility. Going further than purpose. We have a responsibility to be good in the creation and to not leave it worse than we found it. And whether that means we take care of animals, we take care of people, or we take care of climate, or we take care of our kids, whatever that is for us. Like I said a little bit earlier than that, everybody has instructions. You have your divine instructions, whether that's a gospel, whether that's a prayer, whether you know what you're supposed to be doing. And I think we all sat back and we went a step above the labels and the religious parts that we create to make sense of those instructions. The instructions are divine. How we interpret them is ours. Then this is probably somewhere where we may disagree. I don't believe that Christianity is all entirely coming straight from God and is not at all interpreted by people. I think people are part of that process. And to the extent that Christianity and other religions are humanly created, we have an obligation to find places of commonality in order to figure out how to do what we've been put on the earth to do. We're not going to be able to do that if we say, oh, well, you're part of this other thing that's no good and I can't. And that kind of extends further out into the rest of the human sphere these days. It's like nothing is going to change if we're all going to sit in our own room and only talk to ourselves and people we like. This is not how the world gets better. This is not how we fix the problems that we have. Hiding from them, declaring ourselves superior to them, declaring ourselves, this isn't my problem, it's not my fault. It doesn't matter. The way that we solve the problems of the world that was created for us by the divine is together and in dialogue. And we have to find the places that we can dialogue, whatever they are. It might not be everything. We might ultimately have to say, this is not a thing I can do. But one assumes that there are some things that we can do. Given that our religions have so many things in common, there have got to be other things that we can do in common. And I for one would like to see more grace between lots of religious traditions, not just these two, but lots. To just sort of take a step back and remind ourselves, hey, these are also children of the Creator.
Yeah. Oh, that's good stuff, and I definitely agree with a lot of that. And I mean, as Christians, we definitely believe in grace. So we need to practice it more. And like you said, we can be upfront about areas where we disagree. I believe Jesus is the only God and the only one worthy of worship. And we see that differently, and we can be direct about that and honest about it. But in a graceful and respectful, and even in the context of a friendship. And I think that we as Christians need to get better at really at showing that grace and that love. I think sometimes we think that we have to, it's in our control, but we Christians understand that it's not our Bisrat, but it's Jesus's Bisrat, and we're the stewards and the proclaimers of it. And I think about Paul and the Areopagus, who, when he was engaging with practitioners of Hellenistic religion, he was very friendly. He was even affirming in areas where their religion agreed with the Bible and with them. And he also was invited into spaces to have dialogue. He didn't, go in and, tear up people's homes like Siuda did. And so we have our instructions here. And so I agree with you. And I hope that more people in our community, and I just say that because especially, in the Black community, as much as I don't agree, not only clearly with Kemetic communities' theology and their spiritual beliefs, but also even in the Black community, in the Kemetic community, even people's historiography, and as we both have shown that we don't agree with. But as much as I don't agree with those things, I do think that that we as Black Christians, in the context of the Black community, as Christians, we have a certain level of privilege or social privilege or dominance. And I've heard stories from Kemetic, African-American and other Black Kemetic folks that have been really discriminated against and and treated badly by Black Christians. And so, yes, we have to be faithful. I'm, as a Black Christian talking to other Black Christians, like we have to be faithful to the Bisrat and all of that. But we can do that with love and with grace, and we are called to do that. And because it's His Bisrat, it doesn't belong to us. And exactly like you were saying, it came before us. And so, so again, I'm just agreeing with you, but I just appreciate this time. I feel like we could just talk all day and geek out and also try to fix the world's problems. But I just appreciate Dr. Siuda, you coming on. And before we dismiss, I just wanted to also ask if there was any maybe things that you're doing, things you're working on, or just any ways that the audience can continue to follow what the work, your research you're doing, just any things you want to plug or just ways people can stay connected with you.
Oh, that's a good question. I actually I have a Patreon where every day I give out the dates and the religious holidays and the background of the Egyptian calendar, which people find interesting. And I also offer lessons in things like learning how to read hieroglyphs or studying the wisdom literature, which is the ethical text that we have. And I also have an apprenticeship in ancient Egyptian magic for people who are interested in that. It's not a class; it's actually a one-on-one training. I do that. My temple is open to anybody who's interested in being part of it. I'm not making a point, very firm point. This is something that you and I have separately. We don't proselytize. This is not we are not, there is nothing in our tradition that says that we should witness or that people should join us. So I'm saying that thing exists, but I'm not trying to get converts. That's not what I'm doing.
But folks are welcome to come and learn.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. We actually have there's a message forum that's open that has several thousand members at this point. And people come from lots of different backgrounds and talk about all kinds of things that have to do with ancient Egypt and not just the religion. So that's a thing that does. I'm working on a book currently. The manuscript is actually due at the end of June, which is an encyclopedia of ancient Egyptian deities. It's currently called 100 Gods of Egypt. I don't know if we're going to keep that title, but that's what they're calling it. There are actually more than 100 gods, so that's why I'm not sure we're going to keep it. And that should be out, depending on how long it takes to get edited and printed. It'll be out at the end of the year, beginning of next year, something like that. I'm still working on getting my dissertation published. That's a process in progress. So there's lots going on.
Wow. Well, I might have to personally hit you up on those hieroglyphic classes, man. That's because, I got the Coptic, but I need to go back and see the connections there. So
oh, right. Yeah. It helps. Learning hieroglyphs helps with Coptic a whole lot.
Oh, man.
When people learn Coptic, they get told that it's so many percentage of Greek, which it is. It has lots of Greek loanwords, but the entire grammar of it is hieroglyphic. And if you come at it from the hieroglyphic side, it makes a lot more sense than it does if you come at it from the Greek side. So, but learning hieroglyphs is a little bit more complicated because of the script. Lots more letters. But,
oh man, I'm geeking out already. That's man. Well, thank you again, Dr. Siuda, so much. And again, I could keep talking, but hopefully we can have you back again and talk about more topics about early African Christianity and civilizations in general. But again, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. I was blessed by that. Again, we talked about a lot of I think we've shown from different religious perspectives, but also as mutual scholars that again, Christianity is not a copy of Egyptian religion. The two were distinct, have always been, and in fact, that's not even the way people thought about it. And part of that proof of that is that there was a lot of tension, but at the same time, there was some of that was really done in a bad way. So it's really a blessing to be able to sit and talk with a fellow image bearer of the Lord, and also a fellow scholar, and we can have respectful, fruitful dialogue. And so it's not even just about the knowledge and the resources, but it's also about how we go about it and the spirit about it, and being faithful to the Bisrat, and also loving our neighbor and our fellow image bearer. And so it's such a blessing to be able to have a fruitful conversation. And I hope folks will continue to, in grace and in honesty and truth, continue these conversations in our community. And so definitely follow the work of Dr. Siuda. You can actually connect and learn more about her religious community at Kemet, KEMET.org, and also at Netjer, NETJER.org. And then also you can follow some of her historical and language resources at Patreon, PATREON.com /T Siuda, TSIUDA. So definitely connect more and learn more about the our neighbors in our community, and connect and learn and be a living witness of the Bisrat in all these communities. So and also, of course, always continue to follow all the work and ministry of the Jude 3 Project, and also the Bisrat podcast. This is one episode. We have many more coming where we are going to continue to discuss various topics relevant to early African Christianity, so that we can continue to equip the Black church and the Black community to proclaim the Bisrat in our community, in word and in deed. And so thank you so much again for being with us in this conversation. And we will see you on the next one. And I will say today, I'll use the Egyptian word for God, which is Nuda. And I will say to all of you, Nuda bless you all. Amen.